All right, folks, in this particular video, we are in fact going to summarize classes 2, 3, and 4. We're going to continue from where we left off. Now, as you can see on the screen here, we have a definition which is population. Now, the big question is, what is the population? And we refer into ecology, that aspect of ecology. Population, sorry, refers to the total number of living organisms belonging to the same species, all right, in a habitat at any given point in time, for that matter. As you can see in the top left-hand corner, we are seeing a number of snakes. The top right-hand corner, we are seeing a number of birds. I believe that is bats or birds or whatever the case may be. All right. We are also seeing some whales or orcas, to be specific. And the bottom right-hand corner, we are in fact seeing elephants. All right. Now, in terms of a definition, we can simply see ecosystem, and we can also take into consideration it involves community. We also seen definitions like habitats and stuff like that. Well, words, sorry. Now, an ecosystem refers to what? Now, by definition, an ecosystem is a natural environment which is essentially associated with both biotic and abiotic factors. That refers to living and not living things that essentially interact. Obviously, there will be the flow of nutrients, there will be energy transfers and stuff like that. Now, ecosystems are stable. Now, in an ecosystem, you have a multitude of different organisms belonging to different species, belonging to different populations, and a great variety of populations of organisms, that is known as a community. When you have a wide or a great number of organisms that constitute a community, that essentially is like the foundation of an ecosystem at some point. Why? Because those refer to the biotic components that interact with the abiotic components. The living things versus the non-living things. All of them are essentially existing. Living things are existing amidst the non-living things. They are quite dependent upon it. For example, you have different types of ants, you have different types of birds, you have different types of fish, different types of trees that constitute the entire forest. All right, so an ecosystem, by extension, is a stable environment that essentially is associated with the great interaction of biotic and abiotic components. Now, there are in fact a number of different ecosystems. Some of them can be largely conceptualized as terrestrial, all right, which may include forests, deserts, grasslands, mountains. Now, forests, if you were to subcategorize that, we have equatorial forests, we have temperate forests, we have deciduous forests, which exist in different parts of the world. Deserts, some deserts can actually be very hot. For example, the Sahara, the Gobi, the Atacama. Well, some deserts can actually be very, very cold. For example, the great region of Antarctica. All right, we have grasslands. We have the Serengeti regions of Africa. We have those temperate grasslands as well. Apart from tropical, we have temperate grasslands. We have mountainous regions. Some mountains can actually be relatively low in comparison to others. For example, the highest mountain peak in the world is Mount Everest, which exists in the entire range, the Himalayan range, that is. So we have different mountains and they themselves will harbor a variety of different organisms that are well adapted to exist or survive in those regions. Now, we also have marine or aquatic ecosystem. All right. Now, whenever you head into marine ecosystem, you must bear in mind marine refers to the sea or salt water. Aquatic is a general term which conceptualizes the fresh water to be specific. Moving closer, we there is a particular definition, and that definition is ecotone. What is an ecotone? As you can see from the image on the screen here, this ecotone is a transitional ecosystem. That means it exists generally between two major ecosystems. So that begs the question, what is an ecotone? Now, folks, an ecotone is essentially the border, right, between two major ecosystems. Is a transitional boundary between two major ecosystems. That particular zone may in fact possess species that can either belong to none of the surrounding ecosystems, or they may in fact include species that may be associated with both of them, or they can in fact be a mixture, right, of species from the adjacent regions. Now, and a very nice or a very unique example of an ecotone can most probably be the coastline, which separates the terrestrial ecosystem from the marine ecosystem. In some instances, some people highlight like sandbars, right, which may partially be like that transition between the land and also the sea. Now, we're also seeing here main biomes of the world. I want you to take a minute and I want you to look carefully in terms of the distribution of land or whatever the case may be. Look at the color codes and see what they represent. What is a biome? Now, by definition, a biome is a regional ecosystem. It is very large. A biome is a very large ecosystem which may occupy a specific region, a large geographical space. As you can see, these areas that are shaded on the screen here, different color codes, they occupy a very large geographical range. Now, biomes are characteristic and very distinctive. As a matter of fact, they may vary in terms of the animals they possess. They may vary in terms of the type of vegetation, all right, the micro and also, well, by the extension, the macroorganisms in that regard, all right, which may in fact be well adapted to the environmental conditions, which are very specific. Now, there are certain conditions which may be largely influential as it relates to the distribution of said species, many of which can be climatic, much of which is climatic conditions, followed quickly by the distribution of land and sea, as well as edaphic properties, which applies to which refers, sorry, to the soil characteristics. A very nice example of a biome is the tropical rainforest in the Amazon rainforest. All right, we have coniferous forests, we have grasslands, seagrass beds, even deserts. Bear in mind that you revise with your PowerPoints. The notes that were written in the classroom, make sure you revise with it. Now, there are in fact two definitions I would like to knock out here, and those are tolerance range and limiting factor. What is the tolerance range? What is that? Now, it is in fact the limit, right, of an abiotic factor, which is a non-living component of the environment, which influences the survival of organisms or species. If this particular range is in fact exceeded, right, either it can simply be too high, or if it is in fact too low, right, the organisms or species themselves can no longer survive. Can you imagine, for example, you without air, or where the air is very, very thin? Human beings can actually die. Imagine if you exist in an environment where there is in fact too little amounts of water, we would die. Living organisms would die. Or if we have basically too much of water, we will drown. There must be a specific range we can tolerate. All right, the same applies to the exposure to sunlight. Too much is bad, too little is bad. So there must be a specific range in between. Now, in terms of a limiting factor, all right, a limiting factor refers to anything that essentially constrains, right, a population size or a population number. And obviously, limiting factors have the potential to simply negate growth. For example, water, food, mates, habitats, light. Let's think about this for 1 big minute, right? Water. Too much of water is bad. It can actually affect the distribution of species, the productivity of species. For example, you and I, we obviously are mammals. We are not marine organisms. We are not aquatic. We are terrestrial based organisms. So if we decide to just be thrown into the ocean just like that, we wouldn't be able to survive per se directly if we are exposed to the elements. What about food? If there is in fact an abundance of food, the population numbers are essentially high because many organisms will tend to gravitate towards that particular region. But if there is in fact too little, all right, the organisms themselves will tend to be low in number. There will be so much of competition, their numbers can actually be subjected to decline. The same applies to mates. Remember I referred to recently about the blue whale. All right, the blue whales are in fact mating with the Finland whales, creating a hybrid. There are very limited amounts of blue whales naturally existing in the world today. And that is affecting the productivity of the species itself, the continuity. So let's go quickly into the second PowerPoint. Well, this second PowerPoint has to do with biogeochemical cycle. Let us think about that particular term. Bio, it refers to biotic or living organisms. Geo, it refers to land-based or rock structures or earthly or terrestrial. Chemical, as the name suggests, refers to chemical components that exist in the environment. Class cycles are associated with a multitude of processes or stages all of which may occur simultaneously but at different rates. Now, what is a biogeochemical cycle? Or I should say, what are biogeochemical cycles? By definition, they involve the transportation, the transference, or even the transformation of elements within the biosphere. The biosphere, as we indicated earlier, is where all living things exist. Now, this is quite essential, to which we'll be talking about the importance of it later on, but it is significant in terms of the functionality of the entire planet. What are in fact involved in biogeochemical cycles? We have biotic and abiotic factors. We have living and we have non-living. Let us assess that for a minute. The living things like you and I, like our pets, our dogs, our animals, even food that we consume, all right? They are living things, of course, right? And they would in fact be dependent upon nutrients, for example. They would be dependent upon water. All of us would in fact be dependent upon sunlight at some point, which harbors that energy. Plants utilize it for photosynthesis. We utilize it for warmth. And it is also very important in terms of the cyclic transfer of water through the environment. Now, there are, in fact, two general categories of biogeochemical cycles. We have some people say gaseous or gaseous biogeochemical cycles, and some people even say sedimentary biogeochemical cycles. All right, so these are two broad classifications. Now, by definition, gaseous or gaseous biogeochemical cycle is one which is associated with the actual component, all right, that is largely associated with a reserve or a pool or a reservoir derived generally from the atmosphere where the majority of gases exist. All right, the atmosphere is in fact extremely important where it harbors all the gases that exist on the entire planet. Now, very specific examples of gaseous or gaseous biogeochemical cycles include the water cycle, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. All of them, the main reserve exists in the atmosphere. Keep that in mind for me, please. All right. Now, we also have sedimentary biogeochemical cycles, and these are associated with the dominance of the actual component, which is mainly stored or reserved within the actual lithosphere or rock structures, or if you were to conceptualize that as being the Earth's crust. The word sedimentary takes into account particulates or or fine material, examples of which include the phosphorus, sulfur, and calcium. Let's go through quickly. We must bear in mind, in terms of the carbon cycle, now bear in mind all the biogeochemical cycles that we are going to mention. Every single one of them are extremely important for the continuity of life. Every single one. All right. And in terms of the carbon cycle, we are all carbon-based life forms. Now, carbon is a very significant as well as an abundant element on Earth, and it plays a very important role in the sustenance of life. Carbon is essentially stored in all living things. On the rocks, carbon exists in the atmosphere, carbon exists in the water, carbon exists in living things, carbon exists in non-living things. It is a very significant element that is quite important, especially in terms of the continuity of life that exists on this particular planet. It is stored, it is sequestered. There is a term known as sequestration of carbon that refers to the storage of carbon. Certain areas which are associated with major storage, right, of carbon in its different forms, right, these areas are referred to as carbon sinks. For example, the ocean is the largest reserve, has the largest reserve, or it is the largest sink of carbon, where carbon is actually not only stored in the form of particulate matter that exists at the bottom of the seabed, or perhaps those living things that simply swim across the oceans, but carbon also exists in the form of carbon dioxide, which is a gas that can in fact be dissolved in the ocean. The ocean stores a great volume of carbon dioxide. And that is something very, very important. All right. There are also reserves, apart from before I talk about the reserves, I'd like to talk about other examples of carbon sinks or stores of carbon. The forests or the trees, all right, they tend to take in carbon dioxide primarily during the daytime, as you can see in this image here. Plants during the day largely accept or take in carbon dioxide to facilitate plant productivity, to facilitate the process of photosynthesis, where plants manufacture their own proteins, manufacture their own foods. And by extension, this cycle is so important because it actually occurs during the daytime, and animals can actually feed on plants and absorb the carbon concentrations and utilize it for their own development. So atmospheric carbon dioxide, I should say atmospheric carbon, which is carbon dioxide, is in fact absorbed into the plants and is transformed into organic carbon. And that organic carbon is simply ingested or consumed, all right, when we eat plants or animals, or when animals feed on plants, or when we feed on plants. And they assimilate it, they break it down, and they utilize much of it for their own development. And guess what? When you pass out gas, when you burp, right, you would actually release carbon dioxide. When animals pass out their waste, they too release carbon dioxide. Even the solid waste from animals, right, can actually be decomposed, can be disintegrated, and can be broken down by soil microbes as well as macroorganisms, decomposers that is. And they are in fact broken down into finer particulates. Even carbon dioxide is released upon that degree of decomposition. In the world today, we utilize a great amount of fossil fuels, all right, that are derived from within the earth itself, from the breakdown of organic materials that have been compressed within rocks over thousands or even millions of years. We extract it from the earth, we utilize it as a source of energy for transport, for domestic activities, for household activities, for residential activities, for commercial activities, for industrial activities, for transportation. I mentioned that before. And we emit carbon dioxide in very large concentrations. And that actually adds to the atmospheric reserve of carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is merely a fraction of the gases that exist in the atmosphere, but we produce it from a wide array of sources. Carbon dioxide can be produced, or sources of carbon dioxide for that matter, can be associated with respiration, which all animals do, all right, and plants as well. Plants respire as well. From the combustion, all right, of fossil fuels, from deforestation, even from agricultural activities where we simply plow or till the soils excessively. Carbon dioxide is also produced as a result of the general decomposition of organic material, whether through the influence of microorganisms or even macroorganisms. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. All right, let's move on quickly into the nitrogen cycle. Now, class, this is actually a very, very important one because nitrogen is in fact one of the most significant or abundant element that exists in the atmosphere. All right, more than 70% of the gases in the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. All right, nitrogen in the atmosphere is known as N2. All right, and there are in fact a series of processes, all of which occur simultaneously but at different rates. All right, that is associated with the nitrogen cycle. All right, let's bear in mind that the major processes involved, all right, include nitrogen fixation, we have ammonification, we have nitrification, and we have denitrification. Look on the screen, you can see it. Now, what was not mentioned in this particular image is that of electrical impulses from lightning strikes. There are two ways in which nitrogen can be fixed. One, all right, involves lightning. The nitrogen gas with that energy source, which is lightning, would contribute to nitrogen and oxygen fusing together to create nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide can actually be mixed with rainwater, right, to create nitric acid that is brought down to the surface of the earth. Secondly, nitrogen fixation can also be associated with bacteria. All right, and these bacteria may be include associated with those that exist generally, not exclusively, but generally within the root nodules of leguminous crops, like your bori, your same, all right, your peas, Their root nodules contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria, examples of which include um, Azotobacter and Rhizobium. Right? They basically utilize the air pockets in the soil and they extract the nitrogen gas and they convert that essentially to ammonia. And this is actually very important because the peas themselves, or any form of legumes that exist in the ground, they tend to promote nitrogen in the soils, which is in fact very important, by the way. Now, when the animals consume the organic material, all right, such as plants, they eventually pass off their waste. Now, when they pass off their waste, you actually have the breakdown of organic materials, where there is in fact the decomposers being quite active, which exist in aerobic and anaerobic conditions. All right, when organic material is broken down by decomposers, whether it be through bacteria, fungi, you name it, all right, it essentially adds to the ammonium ions in the soils. Now that brings us to the concept of ammonification. Ammonification is in fact the process whereby ammonium ions is in fact created. This involves the nitrogen fixing bacteria which transforms, all right, or I should say produces ammonia in the ground, and it is also associated with the decomposition of organic materials. Now, these ammonium ions, the ammonia in general, it produces a very pungent scent, which is quite typical of the waste that is in fact derived from the dead or decomposing flesh or remnants of plants and animals, especially under anaerobic conditions. But they can also break down stuff under aerobic conditions as well. All right, so keep that in mind for me. Now, we also have nitrification. Now we also have the process of nitrification. This is the process whereby ammonium ions, or I should say NH4 plus, is in fact converted into nitrites, then into nitrates, which is NO2 minus and NO3 minus, respectively. Now, plants can only uptake nitrogen in the form of nitrates because nitrates are easily dissolved in water. They are soluble. Now, nitrification would also involve nitrifying bacteria. Now, all of this I'm talking about is existing on the screen here right now. The nitrifying bacteria, all right, examples of which may include Nitrosomonas or Nitrobacter. Those are two very nice examples. They contribute to the conversion of ammonium ions to nitrites, then to nitrates. Plants can easily uptake, right, nitrates in the soils in solution. Now, nitrogen can be absorbed by plants, which is allowing those plants to simply utilize that component, all right, for leaf development. And you and I both know plants require leaf development for photosynthesis to actually occur. So you see how one cycle leads into another. You see how the environment is very much interlinked. All right. Last but not least, we also have the final process, which is denitrification, which is the opposite of nitrification. Denitrification often is associated with environments which says to be anaerobic, all right, in areas which are very swampy, which are very boggy, all right, where the concentration of oxygen is very low. And anaerobic bacteria, right, can actively transform, or I should say denitrifying bacteria for that matter, can actively transform existing nitrates into nitrogen gas, which can bubble up and surface and be exposed into the atmosphere. So denitrification is in fact the process whereby nitrates are converted back into atmospheric nitrogen. Examples of denitrifying bacteria include Micrococcus denitrificans and Paracoccus denitrificans. Now, class, bear in mind for me that all of these processes that I mentioned here, ranging from nitrogen fixation, from ammonification, from nitrification, all the way back to denitrification, all of them occur simultaneously. Keep that in mind for me, please. That is extremely important. Ways in which we humans or human activities can simply upset the nitrogen cycle. Now, some of these ways may be associated with the use of excessive chemical fertilizers in agriculture for commercial agriculture where monocultural practices are associated. And these excessive amounts of chemical fertilizers may pack a great amount of nitrogen. All right. So we contribute to nitrogen fertilizers, which harbors nitrogen, to be absorbed into the soils. All right, pesticides and stuff like that. And in doing so, we can even excessive use of those pesticides or chemicals or fertilizers can have a very detrimental effect on some of the bacteria. All right, even the denitrifying bacteria as well as the nitrifying bacteria or even the nitrogen fixing bacteria. We have a tendency to use and excessively utilize a great amount of these chemical components. That's a bad thing. Okay, and that is actually something very important to consider. Now, apart from that, some of these chemical components can be leached into the ground. Some of these nitrogen-based chemicals and fertilizers can be leached further down to the ground level, which contributes to what? To the groundwater to become contaminated by nitrogen fertilizers or nitrates for that matter. That level of contamination essentially affects the integrity of the water, and that is something very important. Class, in the world today, we utilize a great amount of fossil fuels, right? We burn fossil fuels as you would have seen in the carbon cycle, all right? Vehicles, for instance, they utilize a great amount of fossil fuels and they produce a great amount of nitrous oxides into the atmosphere. Even that contributes to a very detrimental effect to even animals such as bees, which are very sensitive. Those same fumes from vehicles, when they simply affect certain types of flowers, all right, of existing plants, the bees, that is, would eventually refuse to sit and pollinate because they are very sensitive to that existing stimulus. That could actually affect the bee population. It could affect the honey population as well, the honey production, sorry. And that's a major problem because the ripple effect of that is very profound. All right, let's move on quickly. Now we have the water cycle here. Now, as we are here right now, the water cycle was explained in a different video in the classroom. I will actually, in the description, I will simply place the link for that particular video explaining all the processes ranging from evaporation, evapotranspiration, condensation, precipitation, interception, stem flow, true fall, infiltration, overland flow, percolation, groundwater storage, base flow, and replenishment. All of them would be explained in that very concise video. So check in the description, you will see that. All right. Remember, in the absence of the hydrological cycle, hydro means water, logical is a reasonable explanation. In absence of the hydrological cycle, the water cycle, life would essentially not be able to exist. Guess what? In this same cycle, which is the water cycle, you have the actual transference of what? Nitrates, as we would have seen in the previous slide. Also, carbon dioxide is actively transferred and dissolved in water. For example, the oceans, which happens to be the largest what? Sink of carbon dioxide. All right? Check in the classroom for me. Now, bear in mind that all of these processes occur simultaneously. Let's move on quickly into the phosphorus cycle. Now, what do we know about phosphorus? Now, I mentioned earlier that we are all carbon-based life forms. Yes, so carbon cycle is very important. I also mentioned to you all that nitrogen is a building material or a building block in the amino acid groups, which is in fact important in the development of proteins. In the absence of nitrogen, our cells would not be able to simply grow. Productivity will be negated. Well, guess what? What about phosphorus? Now, phosphorus is a very significant element, which is quite important in the entire world. All right. Nitrogen is for leaf development, and phosphorus is for root development. Now, phosphorus is quite important primarily because of the fact that it is one of those very unique cycles, right, which involves this limiting component. Now, phosphorus is not associated with a gaseous or gaseous fees. I should say steat, my bad. However, phosphorus exists naturally in the rocks, in the bottom of the seabed, in the soils. All right. They can also be absorbed in plants, but they exist in the atmosphere in very small particulate matter that essentially floats and is driven by air currents and stuff like that. Now, all of these processes occur simultaneously. Now, so let's go through this quickly. Phosphates, or I should say phosphorus, right, exists in water, soils, and sediments. It is in fact one of the sedimentary biogeochemical cycles. Now, it is essentially stored and locked away in rocks or solid matter, right? And it is stored and or exist in an anion orthophosphate state. All right, like I mentioned earlier, it does not consist of any gaseous state, but exists in dust particles floating in the atmosphere. Now, look carefully in the image on the screen. All right, this cycle has a very small or low replenishment rate. Look carefully here for me, please. If you will, for example, were to simply say that the rocks on the surfaces here, they are in fact weathered by rain or perhaps by, hold on, they are weathered by rain or perhaps by any activity which involves erosion or weathering or breakdown. Okay, if you look carefully on the screen here, we can simply see rainfall, sorry, simply affecting the mountainous regions where rocks are weathered. That means rocks are disintegrated or broken down. That can actually make it subjected to erosion, where the same fine particulates which contain phosphates are carried in water. This can simply go or wash directly into rivers or streams and directly or indirectly into the oceans to the bottom of the seabed, where it remains and sediment, where it remains and become compressed, or it can simply be washed from the mountains towards the lands, where plants or even animals can simply incorporate that into their tissues, into their cells. Plants actively absorb, all right, very small quantities of phosphorus, highly weathered quantities of phosphorus, which is somewhat dissolved in water. Plants utilize it for their root development and by extension facilitate that level of productivity. Animals feed on plants, and by extension, they feed on the grasses or the soils. Generally, they will incorporate the phosphorus into their system, the phosphates that is, and the excesses will be passed off. To which it can, the organic material, the organic phosphates can be broken down. So, what I'm trying to say here is that phosphates or phosphorus that is derived directly from the disintegration of rocks is what you call inorganic phosphates. But phosphates which are associated with the ground, to which plants absorb or animals absorb, which is found in the tissues of these animals, this is converted into organic phosphates, into living cells or living tissues. There is decomposition of organic materials. And when you have decomposition, microbes act upon the waste. When rain falls or because of surface flow or water movements, these excesses or phosphates or wastes can be transferred back towards the rivers or lakes or into the sea, where it can essentially be allowed to settle at the bottom of the seabed. Now, class, once that happens, we have to bear in mind that once it settles at the bottom of the seabed, it is said to be essentially lost, where the rates of replenishment is very, very low. It takes a long time for those same phosphates to be brought back upon the surface of the land. How is that? Through a process known as geological uplift, where the crust itself rises from the bottom of the seabed over thousands of years, perhaps even millions of years. And eventually, the same process of rain falling on the surfaces of the mountains can actually then facilitate that, the breakdown of rocks. We humans add to phosphate concentrations on the surfaces of the ground or the land by applying fertilizers, inorganic fertilizers, to which plants absorb and convert that into organic fertilizers. Sometimes we apply too much and it can eventually be transferred or washed away into the rivers, lakes, or at the bottom of the sea. So what I'm trying to say is that the phosphorus cycle is in fact very, very unique. All right, the process of replenishment is very slow, but it is extremely vital in the entire environment. You can imagine if there was in fact no phosphorus cycle, obviously root development of plants will be compromised. If the root development of plants are compromised, the plants will actually fall. They wouldn't be able to absorb nutrients. If there are no plants, obviously there will be no animals and the biodiversity will be crippled. So the phosphorus cycle is just as important as all the other cycles that we mentioned so far. So keep that in mind for me, please. Right, so next week we'll be talking about the importance of biogeochemical cycles. So we'll stop here for today. You all have a good one. You all keep safe. Any questions, feel free to let me know. And you can also leave a comment in the classroom or simply at the bottom of the video. Be sure to ask any questions that may be pertinent or maybe giving you any trouble. All right, you all, keep good. Have a safe one. Bye.